Hi everybody, I apologize that I'm recording this video so late and close to our next meeting, but I wanted to give you an overview of the LEAP dataset. I think we're almost finished with entering and improving the data for historical emissions and are well on our way to looking at the baseline scenario. So in this video, I want to summarize what I've done to try and put all the pieces together into one LEAP dataset. So to go through the waste sector, residential construction and transport, I want to then look at the results in current accounts, where there are a couple of things that I think we could maybe improve and I just want to highlight to you, and then highlight what the next steps are in order to be able to create the baseline scenario. Okay, so to start with, we have this Cambodia 2nd of September 2020 version 2 dataset. This Cambodia dataset takes Dr. Sothia's dataset as the basis, as the starting point, and has added in the residential sector and the waste sector that Sam had done. I have then added in the construction emissions, and I have added in the transport emissions that we've looked at. So I don't have anything to say about the residential sector. To me, the residential sector looks perfect and has been all entered correctly. So nothing to say there. Similarly, for the construction sector, everything looks like it has been entered correctly. The only thing that I would, just highlight as a question is that when we talked last time, you mentioned that it might be useful to look at construction separately for Phnom Penh and for the rest of Cambodia, which isn't in this data set. So if that's something that you're still interested in doing, then we could talk tomorrow and maybe discuss whether how we can do that if you wanted to look at the construction sector split between Phnom Penh and the rest of Cambodia. Otherwise, I think that's fine. For the waste sector, the way that the data has been entered is fine. There was just a couple of changes that I made to the analysis. So we'd entered this data here as the waste generation rate, kilograms per person per day, which is correct, but nowhere was that scaled up to give you the yearly amount of waste generated. So I've just added a 365 multiplied by the population in Phnom Penh by the waste generation rate to get us up to the annual waste generation, because before it was giving very low results because we were just looking at the daily amount of waste that was generated. So that's one change that I made. The second change that I made was to put in the correct numbers based on the waste report, the correct numbers for the rest of Cambodia in terms of the fraction recycled and the fraction of waste that is sent to landfill in the rest of Cambodia. Previously, the numbers for Phnom Penh were still in there, so I've just updated that. The other information that I've updated is this fraction combustible, the fraction of waste that can be burned. In Dr. Sothia's report, he writes that they've assumed that 5% of the waste is not considered combustible, so metal and glass. And that's broadly consistent with the information that Kay was able to identify in terms of how much waste, in terms of waste composition studies and how much were metal and how much were glass. It was sort of a few percent in each of the studies. So I think 5% is not a bad estimate. So that would mean that 95% is combustible here. So that's why I put 95% there. So those are the changes that I've made to the waste sector. The biggest sector that we've added into this data set now is the transport sector. And we've added in transport for passenger and for freight. what you asked us to look at in the last meeting that we had was using the data from the Department of Transport to estimate the emissions rather than relying on the ADB data. So we took up that challenge and have used this data. The transport operation vehicles and the driving license holders and the vehicle inspection. So the data on this side of the data set, we didn't know how to use because we weren't quite sure what that represented. The data that we have used are in these three columns: the motorcycle, the light vehicle, and the heavy vehicle registration data. And we have assumed that that registration data represents new vehicles registered in each of these years. And we've assumed that the registration is equivalent to sales. We assumed that, for example, in 1990, 43,700 motorcycles were registered, were sold, were added to the fleet. 3,427 light vehicles. So motorcycles is clear and easy. For light vehicles, we've assumed that this is all passenger cars. We've assumed that these vehicles here are all passenger cars. So they are all transporting passengers and none are being used for freight. And that may not be true. There may be some light commercial vehicles, vans, for example, that are in here, but that's the assumption that we made in order to be able to use this data. For heavy vehicles, we needed to split this up because some of the heavy vehicles will be buses that are used for passenger transport, and others of the heavy vehicles will be trucks that are used to transport freight. So we have split these vehicle registrations between buses and heavy vehicles for freight based on the split in the ADB database. And about 10% of the heavy vehicles in ADB database were buses. The rest were trucks or heavy duty vehicles for freight. So we've used that same split in order to split this data. In order to be able to use this data to look at how the number of vehicles, to look at the number of vehicles that we have in the fleet at any one time, we need to use a stock turnover approach. We need to know how many of the 43,000 motorcycles that were registered in 1990 are still on the road in 1991 or in 2000 or in 2004. So we need to know something about the retirement of these vehicles and how quickly they turn over and are removed from the fleet. So we need to do a stock turnover analysis. And we have done that in Excel. So this is our vehicle registration data here, where we have the number of vehicles that are registered between 1990 and we just use the data up to 2019. We then have data here, and this data comes from a study that was done in Thailand on the survival rate of different vehicles. So these survival rates tell us for passenger cars and for motorcycles, for different types of vehicles, after 1 year, how many vehicles are left? After 2 years, how many vehicles are left? So you can see for passenger cars, or for motorcycles, for example, after 15 years, 30% of the vehicles remain in the fleet. So they have quite a quick turnover, where passenger cars don't turn over as quickly. So we have these survival rates. What we've then set up are these matrices that have the sales of vehicles along the top, and then here the number of vehicles in the fleet in a given year. So this column here, column D here, shows us the number of vehicles in 1990 and how many of those vehicles are left in 1991, 92, 93, etc., etc., all the way down to 2030. So how those vehicles reduce over time. The same for 1991, 1992, 1993. If we take a particular year, let's say 2010, and we add up the 2010 row, that gives us the total number of vehicles in the vehicle fleet in a given year. So this number of 1,096,000 is the total number of vehicles in 2010 based on those survival rate patterns. If we then multiply that by the average distance travelled, we get the total number of vehicle kilometers, the total number of kilometers travelled by a vehicle in 2010. And if we then multiply that by a load factor by 1.5, in this case, we then get the number of passenger kilometers, the number of journeys taken by passengers in a particular year. So that is how we are using the data from the Department of Land Transport to then give us the inputs that we need to LEAP. So for 2010 to 2019, we have the total number of passenger kilometers, which is the sum of the motorcycle passenger kilometers, the light vehicle, and the bus passenger kilometers. We have three categories of values to give us our total passenger kilometers. So that is what I've entered into LEAP here under land passenger kilometers. In 2010, 36.1 billion passenger kilometers. That's been taken directly from this 36.1 here. We then share that out between motorcycles, light vehicles, and buses. What percentage of the passenger kilometers are taken on these different modes of transport? So we can see the percentage of passenger kilometers taken by motorcycle, taken by buses, and taken by cars. We then have that share. We then have the share of different fuels that are used in these vehicles. So for motorcycles, we've assumed 100% gasoline, which I think is a good assumption. Then for passenger cars, we've taken the data from ADB on the split between different fuels. And for buses, we've also taken the split from ADB. So that's what we've been able to enter into LEAP so far. Cars, we have the split between gasoline, mostly gasoline cars, some diesel, a few CNG cars. What we've not been able to do is then split it by technology, split it by emissions technology in LEAP. What we want to do is say what percentage of vehicles are meet Euro 1 standards or Euro 3 or Euro 4 standards. For that, we need to know something about the year that these vehicles were manufactured. So if we know that a vehicle that was imported from Europe or imported from Japan or the US was manufactured in 2003, for example, we can be fairly sure that it would be around a Euro 3 car. If it was if it was built in 2015 in Europe, then it's probably a Euro 6 vehicle. So if we have any information on the year of manufacture of vehicles, or if we know the average age of vehicles when they're imported, if we know that on average when a vehicle is imported into Cambodia, it's 7 years old, 5 years old, 4 years old, then we could do something to get a better estimate of what the emissions are from that vehicle. At the moment I've assigned everything to not meeting any emission standard because I didn't have an assumption to make there. So we've entered all that data and we've done the same for freight, but instead of calculating passenger kilometers, we've got a survival rate, we've got a retirement rate of our different vehicles. And then if we go for 2010, for example, when we add it up, we get the number of vehicles in 2010, then the average distance traveled here, and then the load factor here is the tons of the tons of freight that are being transported. So the average value here is 9. So this gives you then the tons kilometers rather than passenger kilometers, and that's entered into LEAP in exactly the same way. We have the number of tons kilometers here that we've entered directly into LEAP for land transport freight here. So that's how we've entered it, and we've taken the fuel split again from ADB, and we've assumed all the vehicles are uncontrolled at the moment because we don't have a better assumption to make. The final thing that I want to show you is how we have made the baseline projection of passenger kilometers. How we've made the baseline projection of passenger kilometers, which is shown in orange here in this sheet. So we've used a combination of population and GDP growth. This is our historical passenger kilometers that we've estimated. And here I've then divided that by the population to get the number of passenger kilometers per person. You can see here that it's increasing over time. This is the average growth rate. It varies around 10% increase per year in the number of passenger kilometers that are taken per person. It's increasing around about 10% per year, which is a larger increase than GDP. This here is the elasticity. It's how much higher the per capita passenger kilometers are growing compared to the GDP growth rate. So the GDP growth rate is around 5 or 6% per year. The passenger kilometer growth rate is around 10% per year. So there's a sort of 4 to 5% bigger increase in passenger kilometers per person than there is in GDP growth. So we have our future projection of GDP growth, but that's not a good assumption for how our passenger kilometers are going to grow, because they've been growing higher than GDP. So we applied the average elasticity, the average increment of per capita passenger kilometers, and use that as our growth rate. So in 2020, the GDP growth rate is estimated to be minus 3% here. But because our passenger kilometers grows at a higher rate, there's estimated to be a very small increase in passenger per capita passenger kilometers in 2020. Then as Cambodia returns to growth in 2021 and 2022, we get higher growth rates that get back to about 10% per year. So that's what gives us this increase in total passenger kilometers. It's the increase in per capita passenger kilometers, which is linked to our GDP per capita growth rate. I hope that makes sense. For tons kilometers, we've simply looked at the tons kilometer growth rate here and calculated the elasticity relative to the GDP growth rate, and then applied that into the future to calculate the increase in tons kilometre. So we applied similar approaches linking both to GDP growth, but increasing them at a higher rate to reflect what's happened historically. So that's how we've done the baseline for the transport sector. Okay, so I think that's all I want to tell you about what has been integrated into this data set. Now comes the really exciting part, where we can click on results and we can look at the results from our data set for the first time. We can look at where the emissions are coming from for the historical period. I don't think the baseline is quite there yet for looking at our emissions, but for our historical years, 2010 to 2015, I think we've got a really good, nice data set. So let's start by looking at PM 2.5. Our major source is the residential sector, which we would expect. There's a lot of people cooking with biomass. We have transport as a source, waste burning as a source, which you might expect. Charcoal making is also a source. Agriculture is also a big source from agricultural burning, and I want to come back to that for a moment because I think that may be may not be quite correct in terms of that contribution, and something that we should look at before we go forward. If we look at PM10, we find that this contribution from construction increases a bit as well. More of the construction emissions are assumed to be in the PM10 fraction rather than PM 2.5. If we look at other pollutants like black carbon, we see industry is a minor source, residential again, transport, again agriculture is a big source, and waste and charcoal making. Let's look at something like nitrogen oxides, NOx. Transport is a really large source of NOx, and if I click on transport here, I can see that it's mainly freight that is driving that as being a large source of NOx emissions in the transport sector. Again, agricultural burning, waste, electricity generation is a larger source of NOx compared to other pollutants. We expect that NOx is generally comes from electricity generation more than others. So we have that. Ammonia emissions mainly from the agriculture sector, which we would expect. So mainly coming from livestock, which is something that we would expect. So let's look at those agricultural emissions and where they're coming from, because it's a very large contribution, which is why I think it's important that we make sure that we get it right in terms of the contribution that it makes to the air pollutant emissions. We want to be sure that this is an accurate estimate of the emissions from agriculture. So here's the agricultural emissions, and if we look at where the main PM 2.5 emissions from agriculture are coming from, come from agricultural burning of cassava and from rice. They are by far the two largest sources from rice burning. The reason that I pause on that, and I would like to know your thoughts, is when we look at the waste burning report, we don't see cassava mentioned at all. There's no mention of cassava anyway in this report in terms of being a problem from residue burning. So I think having that very large contribution seems strange. Rice is a large source of burning, so that seems consistent with having this a large amount of rice straw being burned. We also have coconut biomass here, which we don't have as a source of agricultural burning in LEAP at the moment. we also have corn and maize and sugarcane, which don't really appear as significant sources. So if I go back to the agriculture sector and then look at agricultural residue burning, I have my annual crop productions here. And then if I look at the total residue burn, which is calculated based on variables, including the annual crop production, the total residue burned, if I look at sugarcane in 2010, is 6.8 thousand tons. If I look at the value here, the amount of residue burned is 104,000 tons, so almost 10 times higher. Sorry, 100 times higher, 2 orders of magnitude higher than what we have in LEAP at the moment. So it seems to me that that's a little bit, something is wrong there. To me, the crop production doesn't seem too wrong. 355 tons per year. We don't have information on the crop production here, but the residue to crop ratio is quite small, and I don't know if that's correct or not, but it's smaller than the other crops, so I think that's something to think about, whether that's right or not. But it seems to me that the values here are very small compared to the amount of sugarcane residue that we're looking at here. Again, for corn or maize residue, we have sort of 400,000, almost 500,000 tons of corn residue, whereas maize doesn't appear on this list in terms of crops that are burned. Rice, in terms of the residue burned, on the other hand, is suggesting here that we have 213,000 tons. Here we have 2,000 tons, so 10 times higher. So we have quite a large inconsistency with the waste report. And I think this is because it's showing such a large contribution, it's important that we try and get this right from this source, so that the basis for the Clean Air Plan is correct and consistent. So I'd like to talk to you about that tomorrow. So I think that's most of what I wanted to cover during this video. I've also begun to I also entered in the baseline data for the GDP growth rate. So we now have the GDP growth rate entered to 2030 based on the data that you sent me. And we can begin to create the baseline scenario and mitigation scenarios. But again, I think that issue of agricultural burning is key to sort out first. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you're able to review it before we talk tomorrow. And I look forward to discussing with you. Thank you very much.